When my brother and his wife kicked out Grandma, they never expected the guilt that followed. Growing up, Grandma was more than just a grandparent. She was the matriarch, the cornerstone of our family. Her house, the little two-story home on Maple Avenue, was where we gathered for every holiday, birthday, and Sunday dinner. As kids, my brother Thomas and I spent our summers there. We'd run through her backyard, climb the old oak tree, and listen to her tell stories from her youth while sipping lemonade on her porch. She wasn't just family. She was our home, our constant in a world that often felt uncertain. Even as we grew older, Grandma was always there. When our parents were busy working, she was the one who picked us up from school, cooked our meals, and listened to our troubles. She had a wisdom about her that made everything seem easier. It was as though no problem was too big for her to handle, and no issue too small for her to care about. But time catches up with everyone, even the strongest of souls. A few months ago, we received the devastating news. Grandma was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. The doctors were gentle but direct. She had 6 months left, at best. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating me, leaving me numb. I wasn't ready to lose her. None of us were. As we grappled with the news, the inevitable question arose: who would take care of Grandma? With her deteriorating health, she couldn't live on her own anymore. It was obvious that she needed around-the-clock care, someone to be there for her in her final months. I was ready to step in, but my apartment was small, a one-bedroom with barely enough space for myself, let alone someone needing special care. That's when Thomas and his wife Carla offered to take her in. They lived in a spacious house on the outskirts of the city, with room to spare. On the surface, it seemed like the perfect solution. Thomas's business was booming, and Carla, who didn't work, had plenty of time to care for Grandma. At first, I was relieved. They had the space, the money, and the resources to make Grandma comfortable. It seemed like the best choice. I thought it was a blessing. The first few weeks went smoothly. Grandma settled into their home, and Thomas would call me every few days with updates. "She's doing well," he'd say, his voice upbeat. "Carla and I are managing just fine." I would visit often, bringing food or sitting with Grandma for hours, just talking and reminiscing about the past. She seemed comfortable, and I was grateful to Thomas and Carla for stepping up. But it wasn't long before the cracks started to show. It started with small comments from Carla when I would visit. "It's a lot of work," she'd say, her voice tinged with exhaustion. I didn't realize how much care she'd need. I sympathized, of course. Caring for someone terminally ill is no small feat, but something about her tone bothered me. There was a coldness in the way she spoke, a lack of compassion that gnawed at me, but I brushed it off, assuming she was just tired. Over time, though, the complaints became more frequent and more pointed. "Thomas and I barely have any time for ourselves anymore," Carla said one day, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "It's been really hard on our marriage." She was no longer hiding her frustration, and I could sense the resentment building in her. Every time I visited, the tension in the house was palpable. Thomas, too, seemed distant. He spent more time at work, staying late at the office or taking on new projects to avoid coming home. I could see what was happening, but I didn't want to believe it. Then one evening, everything came crashing down. I was at home when my phone rang. It was Grandma, and her voice was barely a whisper. "They want me to leave," she said, her words shaky and filled with sorrow. "What do you mean they want you to leave?" I asked, confused and alarmed. Carla. Carla said I'm too much of a burden. She told me it's time for me to go." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. My heart pounded in my chest as anger welled up inside me. How could they? How could my own brother, the same person who Grandma had raised and loved, be so callous? The next morning I drove to Thomas's house, fuming with rage. When I arrived, the tension between Thomas and Carla was evident. They knew why I was there. Carla stood in the kitchen, avoiding eye contact, while Thomas sat on the couch, his face filled with guilt, but not enough to stop what they were doing. "We can't do it anymore," Thomas said quietly. "Carla's exhausted, and I'm barely ever home. It's too much for us." I stared at him in disbelief. "She's dying, Thomas. She has months left. How can you just abandon her now?" Carla finally chimed in, her tone cold and unyielding. "We didn't sign up to be her caregivers. We have our own lives, our own problems. This is too much for us." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman who had sacrificed so much for us, who had loved and cared for us when no one else could, was now being thrown out like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. I knew Grandma would never ask for more than what she needed. She would never be a burden on anyone, but now she had no choice. Without another word, I told them I would take her in. I didn't care that my apartment was small, that I didn't have the resources they did. All I cared about was making sure Grandma spent her final months surrounded by love. The next day, I packed up her belongings and moved her into my place. It was a tight fit, but we made it work. I set up a comfortable space for her in the living room, and from that moment on, I dedicated myself to her care. I took time off work, rearranged my schedule, and did everything I could to make sure she felt loved and cared for. The following months were both challenging and rewarding. Grandma's health continued to decline, but she remained the same strong, loving woman she had always been. Despite her illness, she never complained. We spent hours talking, sharing stories, and laughing about the good times. Every day, I was reminded of why she had been the heart of our family for so long. As for Thomas and Carla, they stayed away. They rarely visited, and when they did, it was clear that their guilt weighed heavily on them. Thomas would call occasionally, his voice filled with regret, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Grandma had no interest in seeing them. She had made her peace with their decision, and she was content spending her final days with those who truly cared. Then, one quiet evening, as I sat by her side, Grandma passed away. It was peaceful, just as she had wanted. She slipped away in her sleep, with my hand in hers, knowing she was loved until the very end. The funeral was a somber affair. Thomas and Carla were there, standing in the background, their faces etched with guilt and regret. After the service, Thomas pulled me aside, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have never let her go. I didn't realize how much she meant to us." But it was too late. No amount of apologies could bring Grandma back or undo the pain they had caused. They had made their choice, and now they would have to live with the consequences. In the months that followed, Thomas and Carla distanced themselves even further from the family. The guilt was too much for them to bear, and they could no longer face the reality of what they had done. Meanwhile, I found peace in knowing that I had been there for Grandma when she needed me most. Her memory lives on in my heart, and I carry with me the love and lessons she shared with me in those final months. As for Thomas and Carla, they are left with nothing but their regret, a heavy burden to carry for the rest of their lives. When Thomas and his wife, Carla, take in their ailing grandmother, they believe they're doing the right thing. But soon, her care becomes too much for them, and they make the heartbreaking decision to send her away. As their grandmother spends her final months with someone who truly loves her, Thomas and Carla are left to grapple with overwhelming guilt and regret. This emotional story explores the consequences of turning away from family in times of need, and the heavy burden of lost opportunities for love and redemption.